Good day. Over the last few weeks, there has been an extraordinary game of diplomatic expulsions going on in Prague, connected to the events that happened in a ammunition depot in the Czech Republic back in 2014. That's 7 years ago. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I am not, of course, privy to all the details of this story, and there are aspects of it that, to be frank, genuinely puzzle me. But I think a brief summary of the allegations that have been made and of the various diplomatic moves would be helpful, and then perhaps certain conclusions can be drawn. Firstly, to start at the outset, there was an explosion at an ammunition depot in the Czech Republic 7 years ago in 2014. This happened at a time when there was fighting in eastern Ukraine between the Ukrainian government that had recently come to power as a result of the Maidan events of February 2014, events which the Russians and the people of eastern Ukraine refer to as a coup, and the forces of the two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. This fighting became very intense. Thousands of people died. There was bombing of cities, and eventually, following a major counteroffensive that was launched by the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and which was undoubtedly assisted by Russia, the Ukrainians suffered a major military defeat. Over the course of that fighting, Ukraine was looking for weapons to supplement its Soviet-era arsenal, which is the arsenal with which it was fighting the war. And at that time, Western governments, specifically the US government of President Barack Obama, were unwilling to go so far as to send weapons directly to Ukraine to assist Ukraine in that fighting. So Ukraine was looking for help to its friends in the West, and was buying arms on a big scale through with the assistance of various arms dealers and arms smugglers of the sort that unfortunately populate the fringes of the intelligence world. Now, I should say immediately that the activities of some of these arms dealers were undoubtedly known by all the big intelligence agencies of all the big powers, and that in the case of the arms dealers who were supplying arms to Ukraine at that time, I have no doubt at all that they were getting the green light from the major NATO governments. So this was probably, to some extent at least, a arms trade that was being carried out by arms dealers, providing arms to Ukraine, and quite possibly assisted by Western governments, and most probably, at least in part, funded by them. Now, the arms that were being supplied at that time would have been weapons left over from the time of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. And indeed, most of the arms dealers who were involved in these activities seem to have been East Europeans, with many of them especially coming from the Balkans. Now, the point about sending to Ukraine Warsaw Pact weapons is, of course, that gave NATO governments at that time plausible deniability. They were able to claim that these arms supplies that were coming to Ukraine from the West were not being supplied by the West at all. They were coming through independent channels, and in fact, they were simply old Soviet weapons left over from the time of the Warsaw Pact, and that the West had no connection or involvement in them. It's the sort of thing that happens quite often in the world of intelligence. And when I say quite often, I should add that at that precise period of time, and on an absolutely massive scale, the United States, to my knowledge, it's been discussed extensively in the open media, was doing the very same thing, buying arms through various arms dealers in Eastern Europe, from arms drawn from old Warsaw Pact arms dumps, and supplying those arms to the Kurds in Syria. This was an enormous arms trade which was being funded and financed and assisted by US intelligence, and it ran into and its cost ran into hundreds and perhaps even thousands of millions of dollars. I know all about this because I did certain very extensive articles about it, following the disclosure of the extent to which this arms trade from Eastern Europe to the Kurds in Syria was going on. And one of the things I noticed at the time is that there were real problems with some of these weapons that were arriving and being supplied to the Kurds from Eastern Europe at the time, namely that these old Soviet weapons left over from the era of the Warsaw Pact were by this time very old, more than 20, some of them more than 25 years old. They had not been maintained in good condition, and some of them were unusable, and some of them were actually dangerous to the users, and that this was a real and severe problem. Now, this has bearing on the events which took place in 2014 in Prague and in the Czech Republic, and which are the background to the recent events in Prague. Because it seems that a Bulgarian arms dealer bought arms, former Warsaw Pact arms, for the Ukrainians at this time, and that they were stored in a big ammunition dump in Prague, except that there was an explosion, over the course of which 2 people were killed and a great deal of damage was caused. Now, at that time, the exact story, the exact detail of the fact that these arms were actually bought by an arms dealer and were intended for Ukraine, to the best of my recollection, was not disclosed. But what is undoubtedly and indisputably the case is that the Czech police carried out a detailed investigation at that time and concluded that the explosion at the ammunition depot was an accident caused either by the poor handling of the explosives or of the weapons that were stored in this depot, or possibly by the fact that these weapons had in fact become extremely volatile and were already dangerous before the explosion took place. And as I said, based on what I know about supplies that were being sent to the Kurds at that time from exactly the same sources, that is not implausible. In fact, it is an extremely likely hypothesis explaining this explosion in this ammunition depot. Anyway, that seemed to be the end of the story, except that a few weeks ago, an allegation suddenly appeared that this deep explosion in this ammunition depot was not an accident at all, that in fact it was a result of a bungled intelligence operation by Russian military intelligence, that the weapons in question had in some way been booby-trapped whilst they were in the ammunition depot in the Czech Republic by Russian agents, and that this was not done properly, causing the explosion to take place and the 2 people to be killed. Now, I ought to say that on the face of it, that is not an entirely implausible or improbable story. The Russians would have an incentive at that time to stop arms supplies moving from Europe to Ukraine. So they have a motive, a conceivable motive. And this sort of operation does happen in the real world of intelligence. Now, I have to qualify that, because when I say that it happens in the real world of intelligence, that is true, but true only up to a certain point. It's the sort of thing that, whilst it does happen from time to time, you are far more likely to read about and see in spy fiction, whether spy novels or thrillers, or spy films and thrillers of the sort that the world abounds in. It does happen in real life, but in my experience, on a relatively small scale. Moreover, I have to say that it's not the sort of thing that I actually associate very much with the Russians. Now, I have to be careful here, because I'm not very familiar with the sort of intelligence operations that go on an everyday basis, and I'm not going to say that I know in detail exactly what Russian intelligence does and doesn't do. So I'm not discounting entirely the possibility that the Russians did carry out an operation of this kind, and that this is the sort of operation that they do carry out from time to time. All I would say is that, to the best of my knowledge, I have never heard of the Russians carrying out many operations of this sort at all. If they were to carry out an operation like this, I suspect that they would avoid carrying it out in a country like the Czech Republic, which is relatively friendly to themselves and with which they are on relatively good terms. If a thing like this were to happen within Ukraine itself, if, say, those arms had reached Ukraine, reached an ammunition depot in Ukraine, and Russian agents there had managed to booby-trap this ammunition, and by the way, the Russians have a massive intelligence operation in Ukraine, and it would probably be relatively straightforward to bribe guards and to arrange all sorts of things like that, well, then I would have said that's plausible and it's likely true. I would add that Ukraine has a history of ammunition dump explosions, partly because, no doubt, of poor maintenance of some of its ammunition dumps, but who's to say that that isn't the work either of Russian agents or of agents from the two breakaway republics? I'm not going to speculate about that. But as I said, if it had happened in Ukraine, if this incident with these weapons had happened in Ukraine, I would not be surprised. However, I am a little surprised that it should have happened in somewhere like the Czech Republic, and I have to say it's not the kind of thing I greatly associate with the Russians. Again, other countries, Israel for example, have a much bigger and more obvious track record for doing this sort of thing. But then Mossad is able to operate in many countries with comparative impunity, so it would not face the sort of diplomatic risks the Russians would be risking if they were to carry out an operation of this kind in a NATO country. Anyway, that's the background to that. So there is one fact that might, however, point to some kind of big Russian intelligence presence in the Czech Republic, and which does beg certain questions. And that is the size of the Russian embassy in Prague. It seems that there are around 80 employees at the Russian embassy, of which a large number are probably intelligence officers. Now, I say that because an embassy with a staff of 80 people is a very large embassy indeed, far bigger than you would expect in a relatively small country like the Czech Republic. And I do wonder, frankly, why that embassy is as big as it is. Now, there have been reports in some sections of the Western media, especially in Britain and in the United States, that this is actually a spy center and that the Russians run a big intelligence operation in Prague and that they use Prague as a place from which to carry out spying, not just presumably in the Czech Republic itself, but in other places in Central Europe. Now, that is entirely plausible, and I would certainly accept that that's a possibility. There are many Czechs who are sympathetic to Russia. It's not inconceivable that the Russians would see Prague as a friendly place, or at least a sort of place where setting up a big spy center, if you like, would be possible for them. But of course, it's important to say, I don't know this for a fact, and again, the mere fact that there might be lots of Russian spies in Prague doesn't mean that those spies are involved or engage in this sort of operation at the ammunition dump that we've discussed. However, I would say this: if that very big embassy the Russians have in Prague was indeed being used for intelligence gathering, then that would obviously attract the notice of the big NATO powers and might create a possible incentive for those powers to act against it, by persuading the Czechs to either reduce the size of that embassy or conceivably even to close it down entirely. Anyway, I digress a little, but let's move on. This information that came out from seemingly nowhere over the last few weeks, that this explosion in this ammunition dump was the work of the Russians, as I said, seems to have taken the Czechs themselves by surprise. The Czech president, in a recent broadcast, has gone further than that. He has said that, as far as he knows, the Czech police and counterintelligence service in the previous 7 years had never connected this explosion at this ammunition depot to the Russians in any way at all, that the information that the Russians were involved came from outside, in other words, from outside the Czech Republic, and we'll come to that in a moment, and that the evidence that he had seen, and he is, after all, the Czech president, so he's presumably in a position to know, is not by any means complete or entirely convincing. So that's what the Czech president has said. It's important at this point to add that the Czech president in question, Mr. Zeman, is somebody who is known to be sympathetic to Russia, has sought to maintain good relations with Russia, a fact which is supported, to my knowledge, by many people in the Czech Republic. The Czechs and the Russians have a long history of friendship with each other and good relations with each other. These were put under strain during the period of the Warsaw Pact, when Czechoslovakia, as it was then, was made forcibly a part of the Soviet bloc. And of course, many Czechs still remember and still resent the events of 1968, when the Soviet army entered Czechoslovakia and crushed the so-called Prague Spring, overthrowing the then government of Alexander Dubček. So there is that history. But overall, and from my visits to Prague, my impression is that a large number of Czechs, perhaps even a plurality of Czechs, feel relatively good feelings towards Russia, and certainly, to my knowledge, on the part of the Russians, or at least those Russians who are interested in the Czech Republic, these feelings tend to be reciprocated. Certainly, when you go to Prague, you see many signs in Russian, which suggests that many Russian visitors go there. Anyway, putting all that aside, President Zeman clearly has his own views about relations with Russia, and there will no doubt be some people who will say that this attempt by him to suggest that this connection to the Russians in the story of the explosion in the ammunition dump is less than convincing, is the kind of thing he would say given his past history. But against that, I repeat again, he is the president of the Czech Republic. He presumably reads and is provided with all the relevant information. And there have been other comments from other Czech officials, including Czech Prime Minister Babiš, which seem to point in the same direction as the comments that the Czech president made. Anyway, regardless of that, the Czechs decided to accept this information that came from outside, decided, despite the apparent lack of convincing proof that the Russians had indeed become involved in the ammunition dump explosion, despite the fact that it took place 7 years ago, and despite the fact that they had not thought it or believed it in all those 7 years. And they made strong diplomatic representations to the Russians, and they took the decision to expel 18 Russian diplomats. Now, that is the point where my real doubts about this whole affair start to become especially strong. Because on the face of it, expelling 18 Russian diplomats over an ammunition dump explosion which took place 7 years previously and which was not connected to events in the Czech Republic itself. In other words, it was or would have been if it had indeed been the Russians who were involved in it, not a hostile act towards the Czech Republic. Expelling 18 Russian diplomats seems an extreme and very radical step to take. And I do wonder whether this isn't really the whole background to the whole story, in the sense that the Czechs possibly were coming under a great deal of pressure from some of their NATO partners to cut down the size of that Russian embassy in Prague because of its size and because of the belief in certain Western capitals that this big Russian embassy was essentially a spy or intelligence center, and that when the Czechs showed some resistance to this or asked for some explanation of why they should do it, they were provided with this information about this so-called explosion in the ammunition dump which the Russians allegedly had engineered. So maybe that explains this extreme step, or seemingly extreme step, of expelling 18 Russian diplomats. If the Czechs had expelled, say, 4 Russian diplomats, the Russians would have perhaps countered by expelling 4 Czech diplomats, but a line would have been drawn under the whole affair. Expelling 18 for an incident that took place 7 years before and which was not directed against the Czech Republic seems extreme, and it does make me wonder whether it was the embassy, that big Russian embassy, that is the true target for this affair, and that it is the size of that embassy rather than the ammunition dump explosion which is the key to solving this particular puzzle. Anyway, what is absolutely clear is that the Czechs completely underestimated and were astonished and taken aback by the severity of the Russian reaction. The Russians countered by expelling 20 diplomats and employees from the Czech embassy in Moscow, more than the 18 diplomats that the Czechs had expelled from the Russian embassy in Prague. Now, the Czech Republic is a small country, and its embassies are, of course, significantly smaller than those of Russia, and for the Czechs, losing so many people, of their people, from their embassy in Moscow, put in jeopardy the sustainability of their embassy in Moscow. It is clear that this Russian reaction came as a profound shock. And following that, they scrambled and started looking for some desperate way, first to reverse or persuade the Russians to reverse this radical expulsion, and then to drum up support from their NATO and Western partners. And so they did two things. Firstly, the Czech foreign minister gave the Russians an ultimatum that unless all those Czech diplomats and employees from the Czech embassy in Prague were allowed to return to the Czech embassy in Moscow, from that Czech embassy in Moscow were allowed to return to Moscow, then the Czechs would retaliate by reducing the Russian embassy in Prague by a further 62 persons, bringing the two embassies, the Russian embassy in Prague and the Czech embassy in Moscow, to the same approximate size. And the Czechs gave the Russians a 24-hour ultimatum to do that. The Russians shrugged their shoulders and said to the Czechs, do your worst. And the implication, it seems to me, is that the Russians have indicated that if the Czechs do go down that road, then there might be more retaliatory action from the Russians, and that might indeed lead to a situation where diplomatic relations between the Czech Republic and Russia are put in jeopardy, or where Czech Republic's economic interests with Russia are threatened. I would add that at about the same time, President Putin of Russia made his famous, or now well-known, address to the Federal Assembly in Moscow, the one in which he talked about Russia having red lines. And he made an extraordinarily vivid point there about how certain countries were behaving like the jackals in Kipling's Jungle Book, which were hounding the tiger. And I think quite clearly that is a reference to the events in Prague. The countries that he was talking about, the countries which were attacking Russia for things that Russia hadn't done, that were behaving like jackals, being put up to do these things by their friends or partners in the West, in the Western alliance. I think that was clearly intended as a not so thinly concealed swipe at the Czechs for falling for this action that the Western powers had led them into. And so now we have a situation where the Czechs were demanding that the Russians allow their people back to the Czech embassy in Moscow, and the Russians told the Czechs, well, we're not doing that. We're in effect calling your bluff, or if it is not a bluff, expect further retaliation. So the Czechs, having taken this step, suddenly changed their timescales. Instead of insisting that those 62 Russians leave immediately, they decided to put it back until the end of May for further diplomatic discussions between themselves and the Russians to take place. And since then, we've had this very remarkable speech by the Czech president, which seems to open the door, or at least it seems intended to open the door for further negotiations. Now, what has happened here? Well, I said that I think in practice that this is a story that has been perhaps quite plausibly invented in order to get the Czechs to move against this big Russian embassy in Prague, which many people in the West doubtless see as essentially a spy center, a Russian spy center. That has put the Czechs, in turn, in an extremely difficult position. And the Czechs must be dismayed by the lack of support they so far received from their erstwhile allies in the West. Specifically, their call for mass expulsions of Russian diplomats by other Western countries have not so far been realized. The US called in the Russian charge d'affaires in Washington and told the charge d'affaires, the ambassador, by the way, the Russian ambassador is in Moscow for consultations and likely to remain there for a long time. The Russians pulled him back after President Biden called President Putin a killer. Anyway, the Americans called in the Russian charge d'affaires, protested about the actions that had been taken by the Russians in response to the Czech expulsions, but so far have done little or nothing else. None of the big Western countries have acted to expel Russian diplomats. So far, the only expulsions of 2 Russian diplomats from each country have been taken by the 3 Baltic states, which can reliably be expected to take the strongest anti-Russian position that they can. So the Czechs must be feeling at the moment somewhat let down, and of course they've been put in a position where their embassy in Moscow has become unviable, the Russians aren't shifting, and it's perhaps unsurprising that they're now trying desperately to find a way to patch things up with the Russians, delaying further expulsions of Russian diplomats from Prague until the end of May, and with the Czech president coming up with these really fascinating comments and observations about how the story of the Russian involvement in the ammunition dump explosion has come up only very recently and came not from the Czechs themselves, but from outside. Now, where has this information come from? What conclusions can we draw from all of this? Firstly, there is one other fact which I'm not up to now discussed, which makes me very suspicious about the story that the Russians were involved in this ammunition dump explosion. And that is the alleged involvement of Petrov and Boshirov, these 2 people that have been identified by the British as the 2 GRU agents who supposedly tried to poison Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury back in 2018. And moreover, I should say that it seems that the information that Boshirov and Petrov were present in the Czech Republic at that time, in 2014, when this ammunition dump explosion took place, may have been leaked from Britain, and there have been stories about it, apparently on the Bellingcat website, a website which, by the way, I don't read. So I should say that I'm not sure that that is the case, and I apologize in advance if that is wrong. But I have to say that I have always had some doubts about Petrov and Boshirov's involvement in the Salisbury affair. And I've had further doubts about whether these 2 people are indeed the GRU, James Bond type spies that people are talking about. Anyway, those are my own doubts. I'm not going to press on that in this program. The one thing I'm going to say is I do wonder whether the entirety of the evidence of Russian state involvement in that ammunition dump explosion in 2014 is that Boshirov and Petrov were apparently traveling in the Czech Republic at around that time. Irrespective of who these 2 gentlemen are, whether they are indeed the kind of pharmaceutical dealers that they pretend or claim to be, or perhaps are, or whether they are intelligence officers. They do seem to have been, up to 2018 at least, fairly itinerant people who travelled to various countries at various times on a variety of passports. And it's perhaps unsurprising that they did apparently pass through the Czech Republic on one of those travels. I'm not convinced that their presence in the Czech Republic in 2014 actually proves anything. Certainly, it doesn't seem to me to prove that either they personally were involved in this ammunition dump explosion, or that the Russians were involved in that ammunition dump explosion in any way. It seems a very threadbare clue, to say the least. So I wonder whether this story that's been floated about Bashirov and Petrov's presence in the Czech Republic at around that time isn't the entirety of the evidence of Russian state involvement in that ammunition dump explosion, and whether this isn't the issue, the information that came from outside and wasn't what was led to the pressure being put on the Czechs to expel all those diplomats from the Russian embassy in Prague, because the true reason being the desire on the part of certain Western governments, big Western governments, to reduce or close down that embassy because of the extent to which that embassy was seen as engaging in intelligence activities. This, of course, is my speculations. Some people will argue otherwise, but I do genuinely wonder about this. And I have to say that this alleged involvement of Bashirov and Petrov does magnify very considerably my doubts about this story. I say that because when these two individuals, these two gentlemen, were interviewed by RT shortly after the events in Salisbury, they certainly did not come across to me as the kind of people I would expect to be tough, professional Russian intelligence officers of the sort which I know exist. So there we go. It seems to me a threadbare story of an explosion, of Russian involvement in an ammunition dump explosion in the Czech Republic, an explosion which, on the face of it, might have other far more plausible explanations about poor handling of weapons and ammunition, which dates from decades before and which is probably not kept in good condition, and which was in transit to Ukraine via the good offices, or bad offices if you prefer, of a no doubt rather dodgy Bulgarian arms dealer, and whether the real purpose of fabricating this story was to actually do something to interfere with Russian intelligence operations by closing down a big Russian embassy which was being used as a base for those intelligence operations. Who's to know? What I will say is this: the strength of the Russian reaction took not just the Czechs, but I suspect the Western powers aback. I suspect that one reason why we haven't seen a string of expulsions from the West of Russian diplomats is because there is now alarm that if this leads to an escalation of a tit-for-tat expulsion war, it will be the West which will find itself with far fewer diplomatic representatives in Moscow than it actually needs in order to continue its various activities in the Russian capital. Moreover, there was that very interesting warning from President Putin during his presidential address about the Russians being willing and ready to take tough, asymmetric action in order to protect their interests. And I wonder whether that warning has also had an effect. If that is true, if this is what has been the cause of the, frankly, rather subdued Western reaction to this, and the other thing that's remarkable about this, by the way, is how little media attention this story has also received in the West, then all I would say is that it again marks a watershed in international relations. Up to now, the Western powers have felt a degree of impunity in taking all sorts of actions to punish the Russians for all sorts of deeds or misdeeds that the Russians have committed or have allegedly committed, and have not been at all inhibited about talking about them at extraordinary and extravagant length in their media and elsewhere. The fact that they're not doing it on this occasion suggests that these Russian warnings are now having an effect. Briefly, the Russian bear has turned. Until very recently, the Russians were keen to maintain at least civilized relations with the West. It's now becoming increasingly clear that they no longer care so much about that. They gave Josep Borrell, the European High Commissioner, the High Representative who came to Moscow in February, an extraordinarily rough ride. They've shown that they're not willing, that they're willing to respond toughly to any sanctions that are imposed upon them, and that they will respond toughly to any diplomatic expulsions also. One senses a sense of dismay in Western capitals, massively reinforced as it was by that massive Russian build-up on the Ukrainian border in response to the Ukrainian build-up that took place in the spring. And I sense that the point has now come where the bear has not only turned and perhaps shown its teeth, but where Western governments have begun to sense this and are themselves pulling back also. If so, then an important moment in international relations has been reached. Thank you for joining me again for this long video on this again intricate and complex topic, and rather strange topic also. I look forward to you joining me in future videos, both on this channel and on our other channels, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. Please also check us out on our own other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and Odyssey. And please also look us up. Please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And remember, we accept donations and payments in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. And last but not least, check out our Discourse server and come to our shop. Get yourself the wonderful things that you will find there, our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me on this program, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and have a wonderful day until then.